So you've now seen Food Inc. In this video, we're going to be talking a bit about why we asked you to see the film, and we're also going to talk about some of the details that come out of the film that we hope that you'll take away and keep in your mind for the rest of the course.
So Adam's going to articulate the perspective of the film, and I'm going to play the role of devil's advocate a little bit, arguing against the film and problematizing its perspective.
So one reason why Food Inc. is very valuable for students to watch is that it provides really useful background on the industrial food system, tells you a lot about what it is and how it works, and how it's different from the way that food was produced in the past. So I'll just mention a couple important details from the film. So first, you get a sense from watching Food Inc. of how different the animals are that are raised today than they were, say, 60-odd years ago. So the filmmakers mentioned that chickens today reach slaughter weight in half the time that they did in the 1950s, and when they reach slaughter weight, they're twice as big. And that's just changing the way that changing the kind of animals that we're raising through breeding.
So what I want to say in response to that as an advocate of the industry is that in a way, the film is, I think, dangerous because it takes the perspective of a kind of romantic 19th century past to which we will never return, where all these chickens are running around and they're, very slowly coming up to slaughter weight, and then we kill them by hand in the way that Joel Salatin and his friends do at the end of the film. I think we should view this development of new kinds of animals that can be brought to slaughter weight very quickly and provide a ton of meat relative to other parts of their body mass as a great triumph for our efficient, market-directed, technologically based system.
Yeah, so that's what defenders of the industry will say. As you see in the film, though, one worry about the fact that chickens are so big nowadays when they reach slaughter weight is that they're so big that they can barely support their own body weight, and in many cases they can't. And so the chickens can take maybe one or two steps and then that's it, they're done. And that's just a consequence of the fact that the chicken breast is so big, because that's what people want, that they're just not built on the lower part of the body to support that weight.
Right, so I see the problem, but I think that farming is as much an art as it is a science, and we need to look for that slight, precise adjustment so that we can get chickens that are, of course, not completely overweight such that they can't move at all, which I agree is a bad thing, but we don't need to try to return to some bucolic past that is completely out of, it's just unrealistic.
Okay. Well, another issue that comes up in the film about animal welfare is about the fact that nowadays when we're raising cows, we're not feeding them grass for their entire lives.
Right.
So in the past, that's what we've done because cows have evolved to eat grass. Instead, what we do is we feed cows grass at the start of their lives, and then we send them off to CAFOs, confined animal feeding operations, where we feed them a diet of grain. So, for example, corn, because that's a really cheap grain that's subsidized by the government. And as a consequence of the fact that we're feeding cows stuff that they have not evolved to eat, the diet of corn ends up making the cows sick, which requires that we administer antibiotics to them. Mm-hmm. And of course, that raises worries about superbugs that have developed resistance because we've fed all of these antibiotics to the cows.
But you're ignoring, and the film I think ignores, a lot of the good aspects of this development. One is that it's much better in terms of climate emissions or greenhouse gas emissions. You want to get the cow up to slaughter weight as quickly as possible and then produce the meat, harvest the meat. And by finishing them, all cows are pasture raised. There's no such thing as a cow that only eats corn and soy. But it's true that in the concentrated animal feedlot operations, we in the industry do feed cows a lot of grain really quickly, and that brings them up to this amazing slaughter weight, and we can then harvest it, and they've produced a lot less by weight of emissions than these cows out on pasture that take forever to get up to the relevant weight. So per pound of beef, the concentrated industrial method gives you a lot less by way of greenhouse gas emissions.
we'll talk about this more later
Okay.
in the course. But another worry about the industrial food system that comes up in Food Inc. is that it relies very heavily on migrant farm labor. So we're talking about workers who've come from, say, Mexico, if we're talking about farming in the United States, and who are paid very low wages, live in really bad conditions, work under really bad conditions, and who are bossed around by their bosses. They don't have much recourse, really, because what are they going to do? They don't have any power. They're here illegally. They can be deported if they're reported to the immigration services. So that's another concern, is that this is a necessary part of our current food system, but it seems like it's violating people's rights.
I guess I just don't see why you'd have to think of it as necessary. So I agree, there are problem cases, there are some bad apples. The government and regulatory agencies need to be involved and try to improve the situation. There shouldn't be illegal workers at all. There should be an availability of unions for workers. The industry, I think, isn't essentially reliant on unjust labor. I think that there need to be adjustments and processifying measures made in order to get rid of some of the deep injustices that you in the film are mentioning. But we shouldn't just think that the whole industrial system as a result is unworkable.
Okay, well, like I said, we'll talk more about these problems with the industrial food system later in the course.
Okay.
Another reason why we asked the students to watch Food Inc. is that it also gives you a glimpse of some alternatives to the industrial food system. So one alternative that's mentioned in the film is the sort of Joel Salatin model that we're later going to be calling the Ithaca response. And so the idea here is that maybe what we should do is move to a model where we're not relying heavily on petrochemical fertilizers and herbicides, where we're sending these animals off to feedlots that pollute the environment and that are bad for animal welfare. Instead, maybe what we should be doing is focusing on organic farming on a small scale, rotating animals around in the way that you see Joel Salatin does in the film. Maybe that's the alternative that we need that would solve these problems that we've been talking about.
So two things in response to that. First is, it looks as though markets just push suppliers to kind of go big or get out. And we see in the case of Stonyfield Farms in the film that they started as a kind of small organic operation. We have some here in central New York doing Greek yogurt, which has now become a big deal. And as they succeed, they scale up. They want to get bigger, right? And so then you face some of the same pressures to get low-cost labor. You have difficulty getting in the amount of supply that you need. And in any case, there is, just because it's organic, no guarantee at all that you're not dealing with a massive corporation with a huge global reach. So big organic certainly exists and may have some of the same problems you're worried about with the system. Secondly, the other thing about organic that you might worry about is it's not as though organic farming, especially big organic, doesn't use fertilizers or even pesticides. So James McWilliams, who's going to be one of our speakers, we'll interview him in the course, points out in one of his books, Just Food, that almost every operation, certainly any really large-scale operation, is going to have to use pesticides, and so-called organic pesticides can turn out in lab tests to be just as carcinogenic in rodents, which is what they usually test on, as some of the synthetic pesticides. So we shouldn't assume, there's a kind of ideology in this film that suggests that anything that's organic is just better, but I think there's a lot of complications in the details that you have to look at. I also think Joel Salatin appears here as this messianic figure who's going to save the day, but there, as we'll find in the course as we interview him personally, there are questions about how you can scale out his method. There are worries about whether his animals are all that much happier at slaughter time than the animals in the system. I mean, we see, those chickens are getting their throats cut and they're bleeding and they're noticing their friends getting the same treatment. So I think that the film has a little bit of a propaganda aspect to it, where it's really pushing a kind of model from a bygone era that's going to be very hard to use to feed the world.
What you've just seen now is a little bit of the back and forth about the industrial food system that we're going to be going into a lot more detail about over the course of this MOOC. So we're going to be examining a bunch of arguments for and against the industrial food system, talking to a lot of defenders and opponents of the industrial food system. And the point of this video was to just get you thinking critically about Food Inc., because it's pretty easy just to accept what the sort of viewpoint that's pushed by the makers of the film. Maybe in the end we should accept the viewpoint of the makers of the film, but that remains to be seen. And the only way to figure out whether we should is to think about the details here.
We also wanted to model for you a way in which some of these arguments would occur. So I was playing devil's advocate and arguing against the film and for the industry. It's important as we go through the MOOC for us to think about ways in which we would resist even something that seems very compelling, films with music and atmospheric setting that makes you kind of emotionally move in a certain direction. Part of the important thing we're trying to teach ourselves to do here in looking at all these empirical facts and figures is to resist being moved by propaganda and instead try to really look at the philosophical arguments and the empirical facts.